Welcome back, everyone. I know it's been a while, but sometimes in life you just have to do what you have to do. And I can safely say that it's nice to be able to come with a new topic of discussion, something that we can spend some time on as you hear my thoughts and opinions on a rant that I actually had in a conversation quite recently. I was involved in a conversation in which the topic of what game should I play, Tormented Souls or Alisa? That was generally the gist of the conversation. And the points that were brought up were quite interesting, not the topic of this particular video, but overall looking at how survival horror has developed to modern times and this resurgence of more classic styled survival horror games, both in appearance, art style, and in gameplay mechanics, has been something quite refreshing for me personally over the past couple years. You could say maybe 3 years or so, and it's been a good experience with its ups and downs. And I feel like this is one of those moments in which I just have to break the silence on something that came up in this discussion of Tormented Souls versus Alisa. And fair and fine, this is something that came up in a lot of Alisa reviews when the game first came out. If you don't know, it's a retro-styled PlayStation 1 survival horror game, classic survival horror in the vein of Resident Evil and Dino Crisis mostly. One thing that will come up in a lot of reviews is the combat systems in that game and how frustrating they can be. So I want to leave my record as well to talk about this, and I'm coming here just to talk in particular on one particular mechanic. There are many things we could talk about, we could go into depth with, but what I would really want to talk about is the aiming system in Alisa. Before we begin, I just want to rehash or retell a section of this conversation as I was giving some advice. What I had said was, despite all the differences that we've talked about between these two games and our knowledge in what classic survival horror should be, one thing you have to understand is this: if you care about engaging in all aspects of combat within a given title, and you care to gain mastery over the combat, plus have an experience that is slick and enjoyable to some degree, I gave the advice that go play Tormented Souls. The reason being the aiming in Alisa is dog shit, for a lack of better words. So this is what this video is gonna be about. It's about how Alisa's aiming system, in my opinion, fails and actually takes what could have been a very enjoyable, a very great game overall, and knocks it down a couple of points. This game could have reviewed better, it could have been received better, especially amongst the survival horror crowd, if only it had combat mechanics that worked well and an aiming system that just made sense. So welcome everyone, one and all. This is going to be a case against the aiming system in Alisa. So first, before we even break down all my complaints on what's wrong with the aiming system in Alisa and maybe give some examples of what I feel like the game does poorly in that regard, first I guess we can talk about what is aiming in the traditional classic survival horror games. I'm going to use a few examples just to keep it brief. I didn't come here with a vast amount of information from various different games, but I'm just going to look at the franchise that inspired Alisa. We're going to look at the first Resident Evil games, and we're going to look at Dino Crisis, and just speak on how aiming works in those games. Generally speaking, this is the gist. This is how things work. Whenever, rewind, you're back in the 90s, you're playing a new release of Resident Evil 1, one thing you'll have to understand about the aiming mechanics is this: when you equip your weapon, whatever it may be, you can press the button to aim, right? Of course, times have changed. Who knows? You could be playing it on PC, you could be playing it on console, so I won't specify which button that was, but you press the aiming button. Bear in mind, these games use tank controls, just like Alisa does now. So you are running around, and when you press aim, you go into a dead stop. Within this dead stop, your character immediately aims the nearest opponent, right? The nearest enemy. If there is no enemy nearby, your character will stop and aim in front of them. This system on its own is already very efficient in the sense that tank controls allowed for, how can I say? Getting used to tank controls was difficult back then and even now for most people. But when you could use the tank controls, it allowed for very precise movement, because up was always your character moving forward. This is very important because these games relied on fixed camera angles. Therefore, as the camera is panning from different angle to different angle, showing you different shots of the environment, you can always be reassured that when you press a specific button, up, your character will always move forward. Therefore, as you are having this kind of cinema style effect of the fixed camera angles shifting, you can always make adjustments of movement through enemies, through hazards, through the environment, and the change in camera angle will not actually hinder you that much. This was the purpose of the tank controls, and I feel like though the tank controls were a limitation in the time, they developed into a very efficient style of play. Hence why you still see tank controls in some games even today within the survival horror space. So just to put it into perspective. So you press the aim button, you stop. If there's no enemy, you aim directly in front of you, wherever the character is facing. If there is an enemy, when you press the aim button, you auto aim straight to that nearest enemy. Of course, this can be variable in situations in which there are multiple enemies. We'll get into that a bit later. But the point is this: you stop and you aim. The good part about this is that since you're using tank controls and moving throughout the environment, there can be situations in which an enemy is not in front of you. There can be a situation whereby you are forced to engage in an enemy that's to your side or behind you. Maybe it was a jump scare. It could have been just poor maneuverability of you against the enemy, and you have to make quick adjustments. So when you reposition yourself and aim, your character then turns around and faces the opponent. Partner that with the precise movement of tank controls, you are able to engage and disengage combat very quickly, very efficiently, quite smoothly if you ask me. And you can fire off a couple of shots and run away again. Quick turn and go. So the fact that the traditional aiming system was an auto aim system allowed you to fight more effectively. But let's go into a little bit more depth in how the auto aim system even worked. When you aimed, you also had the option, of course, to turn left or turn right. This would allow you to aim other enemies or other objects within the environment without having to move towards them. You don't have to get close to them so that the auto aim aims that target instead of another target. So if you're shooting one target, maybe it's to your left, or let's rewind that. You're shooting against an enemy in front of you, and it has a target to its left and to its right. You can shoot one, maybe for example, blast it away with a shotgun, aim to the left, blast that one with a shotgun, and aim to the right and blast the other one without having to move. This is typical aiming, nothing amazing, it works pretty well. But another option that was available is that you can hold up and hold down. This is where there is some nuance as to what's the purpose of this. Situations whereby you are in a room with enemies, and let's say there are 3, zombies. They are walking towards you. By aiming up, what you're changing is this: you are prioritizing the chance to get a headshot instead of the chance to get body shots. Of course, when the enemies come towards you and you're aiming up and you fire the gun, you are still firing against the body. The only difference then is there is an increased percentage chance that your shots become headshots, dealing more damage, right? So there's a priority shift. Instead of damage being dealt to the overall target, the priority shifts to increased chance to hit head. If head is hit, therefore more damage. Generally, that's how I think the coding would work. Now, if in that same room, instead of it being like a grounded zombie walking towards you, let's say there's a flying monster and a zombie and they're both coming towards you. If you aim up, it means give priority to flying opponent first. So even if they're walking in a straight line towards you, the flying opponent will get the damage first. If it dies or moves to a place where it cannot be shot, then your bullets will prioritize the grounded opponent. But so those are generally what you would get for aiming up. Aim up means prioritize flying opponent, then give increased chance to headshots, then give standard chance to body shots, and reduced priority to crawling enemies. And generally speaking, the same can be said for aiming down. Aiming down means that you are giving priority to any grounded enemies. So for example, you shot the legs off a zombie, or there was just some crawling zombie to begin with. The crawling zombie gets priority to all damage first, then the standing grounded enemies, and lastly, if possible, a flying enemy. But in all cases, aiming up, aiming forward, and aiming down all have auto-aim embedded into them. What changes is the priority of damage distribution. This allows you to quickly move around and aim up, straight, or down according to what you need in any given situation. And you are guaranteed that the fact that you aimed, you are going to hit. The only question is, what will you hit for what damage? So the numbers and the statistics behind the game are what are in effect when you're dealing damage, but you know that your aiming is being rewarded with damage nonetheless. Now, knowing this, Alisa takes this system that worked pretty fine for a majority of survival horror games and decides to ditch it for a totally different system. Not totally different, but a bad system nonetheless. What Alisa aims to do is to remove the aspect of auto-aiming. So, you can press the aim button. The aim button does point the gun forward. You can then pan to the left, pan to the right, pan up, and pan down. But this doesn't actually mean anything for all intents and purposes. This is just moving the 3D model. What you have to know is that there is no auto-aim. So in the game world, what happens is whenever you hold the aiming button, a state is triggered within the game. Is there target or is there no target? How this is determined is that there is an invisible reticle that is, how can I say, attached to the character model in the opposite end of the room. So if I'm standing in a hall and I press the aim button, if we could zoom out and see this invisible reticle, you would notice that there's a dot that is plastered on the opposite wall of the character where they are facing. Now, when you pan left, this dot moves to the left of the room. If you pan right, the dot moves to the right of the room, up, down. Of course, you cannot see it, but it's the state in which the game is working. And what the game is looking for is the state of that dot. Is this dot in or on the path of an enemy or not? If no, no shot hits. If yes, all shots hit. And that's it. So someone may think of it and be like, well, kinda sounds like the same thing. I would say no. And this is why I would say no. The problem is when you're working with a game like this where it's on a state on, state off basis, it means that it doesn't actually matter how the 3D models look like in space. So long as that reticle state is off, you have missed. So they try to rectify this by putting an icon next to your ammo counter. If you look at the bottom right of the screen, you'll notice there's the icon for your gun, the number of bullets in the clip, and then the reticle icon is shown there. If it's highlighted, it means state equals on, therefore you hit. If it's off, it means state equals no, therefore you miss. So you can have a situation in which maybe you ran into a monster by mistake and you are panicking, scrambling, trying to aim. And during this moment, let's say I take a photo, and in the photo, the character models are actually facing each other. Really, they look like they're facing each other. But the game doesn't read that you have aimed the right spot because each enemy has a hurt box. Technically, it should. But the game believes that the reticle has not landed on the correct position, therefore it is not on the hurt box of the enemy. Therefore, the icon doesn't illuminate. You fire and you miss. But yet the 3D models are looking like they are facing each other directly. This is problem number one, and it's a big problem because the enemies are very quick in this game, much quicker than some other games, much quicker than the enemies in Tormented Souls. So you can have a situation in which you are frantically trying to aim, but you can't keep up with the enemy's movements, and the reticle is off most of the time as you're trying to adjust. You're firing shots and you're missing. Though the 3D models look like they're in alignment, but they're actually not. Frustrating at the very least. Luckily enough, it doesn't happen 100% of the time, but it happens enough of the time for you to notice that it's happening. It's a really big problem. And you can have situations, like I said, this is a situation in which you can see that you are aiming, but the game doesn't register that you've aimed. Then the inverse is true. There are some times where it looks like the shot should miss, but the shot is connecting because the reticle is on, and the reticle, the state system of the game, doesn't care what the 3D environment looks like, what the models look like, what actions they're in. It doesn't matter. So long as it reads the state as positive, shots will land. And that is just sad because there's a disconnect between what the player sees and what's actually happening within the coding of the game. And at the very least, it's just not intuitive. I played through the whole game and never once did I really feel comfortable within the aiming system. I always felt like the shot is going to miss. I wasted a lot of ammunition in situations where I was trying to aim, trying to fire, trying to survive and missing because the game just decided that I'm going to miss no matter how much I try to align the shot. And it's so obscure, it's so crazy that you would have or try to implement a free aim system into a fixed camera angle game. That in itself should have been the red flag that players should have noticed in the marketing of the game. How can you have a free aiming system in a fixed camera game? It just doesn't make any sense. But I'm going to rewind it just a little bit, this discussion. During that discussion in which I was talking about Tormented Souls and Alisa, one of the things that came up as a reoccurring theme is that Alisa is quite a creative game in terms of the aesthetic that was used, the art style, types of monsters, the color palette, all these things, the music, the environments. It was quite an interesting and quite creative idea to turn a survival horror into something like what Alisa turned out to be. I cannot take that away from the developers. They did quite a good job. So in this case, funnily enough, there are also creative ways to manipulate the same shooting system. I'm just going to give an example just to paint a picture in your mind. Imagine if you are in a very, very large room. Let's think of the main hall of the game. Within the main hall of the game, there is 2 connecting corridors, steps to a balcony, the ground floor, and a connecting room, all of which have enemies. Alisa is the only game, well, at least the only game I've played, in which I can be standing, for example, in the main room, and the enemy is 2 rooms away on the balcony. I haven't actually seen the enemy visually within the game. The enemy hasn't even triggered, it's not coming towards me, right? But maybe let's say I've already played the game before and I know the enemy is there. You can stand 2 rooms away, however many camera panels that is, just stand and start aiming into space. Just keep on adjusting and aiming into space. And someone might wonder, why are you doing that? And I would say, just keep aiming until that reticle at the bottom right corner of the screen turns on. Because like I said, it's a state-based system. If that reticle is on, it does not matter where the enemy is. You will fire, you will miss, you'll fire and you will hit, and the enemy will die. And that's it. So players who go into Alisa, who already have pre-existing knowledge of enemy positions, maybe because they've already finished the game multiple times and they're quite familiar with the environments, you can cheese and kill enemies in very creative ways without even getting to the threshold for them to trigger. Because you know, if Alisa faces in this direction in this room, there's a set number of enemies in front of her. They have not triggered, you have no sight of them, they have no sight of you, but you can still aim and the state system will still take care of the situation. So you can find creative ways of killing enemies without actually encountering them, and that in itself can make new styles of gameplay, you know, because the gameplay, when it works, is interesting. Hot swapping guns, can't reload from the menus, and having to outmaneuver the enemies with this free aim system and the fixed camera angles. You can come up with your own kind of strategy in dealing with the situations. And then add the fact that even in situations whereby the enemy hasn't recognized your position yet, if you have prior existing knowledge, you can still manipulate the combat system and take advantage of the enemy's position, killing them before they can even be triggered. So that can be the positive in the situation. But overall, I believe that the aiming system was not really done well, in the sense that there is no aiming system and it's quite bad. So I just wanted to throw this out there. This is my case against the aiming in Alisa. I wish that if there were to be a follow-up game to Alisa, that they go back to the more traditional aiming that they are inspired by in terms of Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Go for the auto aim. It's a tried, true and tested mechanic. It works well. You can find some intricacies that you can add into the template of the mechanics that already works, but I would not advise going free aim in a fixed camera angle game. So I hope this helped someone who was as frustrated as me with the game, and until next time, this was a case against Alisa's aiming. See ya.